Good evening, everybody. My name is Jack Halberstam. I am a professor of English and Gender Studies here at Columbia University and the director of the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender. I am delighted this evening to welcome you to this important event celebrating the work of Tina Campt, and most specifically, celebrating her new book, A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See. This event has been a massively collaborative effort between the Institute for Research on African American Studies, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender, and the Center for Race and Ethnicity, all here at Columbia University. We have assembled a fantastic lineup of speakers and respondents for a conversation about the book. And the evening will be hosted by Professor Mabel O. Wilson. So I'm going to introduce Professor Wilson and then turn over to her to introduce the speakers tonight. Professor Mabel Wilson is a cultural historian, architectural designer, and curator. She teaches architecture and Black studies at Columbia University and serves as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. With her practice studio, she was a member of the design team that recently completed the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. And for the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, she was co-curator of the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. Please welcome Mabel Wilson.
Thank you, Jack, for that generous introduction. And it is really my pleasure to introduce what I think is a really stellar group of both scholars, thinkers, makers, and colleagues. And so I'm going to begin with the person we are celebrating today. Tina Campt is the Owen F. Walker Professor of Humanities and Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She's a Black feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art, and had the privilege of serving 3 extraordinary years directing the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Campt leads the Black Visualities Initiative at the Kogut Institute for Humanities, and is the founding convener of the Practicing Refusal Collective and the Sojourner Project. She is the author of 4 books: Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender and Memory in the Third Reich, University of Michigan Press in 2004, Image Matters, Archive Photography and the African Diaspora in Europe, Duke University Press, 2012. Also with Duke in 2017, Tina published Listening to Images. And most recently, as we celebrate tonight, she published A Black Gaze with MIT Press, where she continues to listen to images, as she so eloquently and forcefully writes, quote, "I believe that the physical and emotional labor required to see images gives us profound insights into the everyday experiences of Black folks as racialized subjects," end quote. And that is on page 78 of this really wonderful book. But what I appreciate and value most, I think, about Tina's oeuvre is how she crafts a practice as a writer, a critic, and as a scholar. As we find in the various verses of A Black Gaze, she insists on always locating herself her body, her thoughts in the field, with the work, and with others, sometimes on a squishy beanbag in a gallery, in a cab, on the hard floor of a studio with her back on the wall, computer open, writing, thinking, looking. But I think more importantly for us, it is a practice grounded in care and generosity, kinship and friendship, as she invites us to look, listen, think, sense, and feel with her. And while a Black gaze is attentive to the racialized spaces where artistic practices, making, displaying, and encountering the work take place, I hope we can converse with her and her interlocutors this evening about what a Black gaze shares about her different modalities of her creative and intellectual practice as it unfolds in the racialized academic spaces where we write, make, think, and teach. Now, we are delighted that joining Dr. Campt is Dr. Michel Gillespie, who is a film professor at the City College of New York and the Graduate Center at CUNY. His research and writing focuses on Black visual and expressive culture, film theory, visual historiography, popular music, and contemporary art. His publications of note are Film Blackness, American Cinema and the Idea of Black Film, and co-editor of Black One Shot, an art criticism series on ASAPJ, which is a really must-read. His recent writing has appeared in Film Quarterly, the Criterion Collection, and Ends of Cinema. And his current book project is entitled The Case of the Three-Sided Dream. I also want to welcome this evening Dr. Tavia Nyong'o, who serves as the chair and holds the William Lampson Professor of Theater and Performance Studies at Yale University, where he is also a professor of American Studies and a professor of African American Studies. His remarkable range of publications include The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performances, and the Ruse of Memory, and the important Afro-Fabulations, the queer drama of Black life. For his next project, Tavia is currently embarking on a study of critical negativity in recent Black studies. And most recently, Dr. Nyong'o serves as the curator of public programming for the Park Avenue Armory here in New York City. And also joining us is Dr. Christina Sharpe, who is a writer, professor, and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Studies in the Humanities at York University in Toronto. Her publications include many groundbreaking contributions, including In the Wake, On Blackness and Being, and Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects. In March 2023, Dr. Sharpe will publish her third book, Ordinary Notes, with NOF in Canada and FSG in the US and DAUNT in the UK. She is currently working on a monograph called Black Still Life, which will be published by Duke in 2025. So needless to say, this is a rock star convening. And now I will turn it over to Tina Campt, who will share with us a Black gaze.
Thank you so much, Mabel. Thank you, Sharon, in the background. Thank you to both of our ASL interpreters for your marvelousness in translating our conversation. Thank you, Jack, as well, for your introduction. And thank you to both Iras and to Earwigs, for the collaboration that has brought us together. I am really delighted to be in the company of people whose work has truly shaped the way I think, and particularly shaped the way in which this book came into the world. My only regret is that we cannot be together in person. That would be such a delight, and it would be more than a delight, it would be sublime, because it's been months and months and months, if not years, since I've seen some of you, and I miss that gathering, that possibility of gathering. I am not going to speak very long because I'm really excited about the format of these conversations being actual conversations. But what Mabel asked me to do is to say a few words about the book and to maybe read a short excerpt from it in order to begin the conversation. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to just start by answering a question that I did a virtual book tour last semester over the course of several months, and it was so incredibly enriching to talk to people about the book, just as it was, sort of being born and coming into conversation with people. And there was one question that kept being posed to me in lots of different ways that I now try to speak to. And that question is, why did I write the book? And why did I write this book right now? And it's a question that I answer by saying that I say this in the book as well, is that I did not set out to write this book. It is not one of those books that was gestating in me for a very long time. I did not set out to write a book about a Black gaze. What this book is actually a transcription of a conversation that was going on in my head for quite some time, for a couple of years, in response to some really, really, really powerful artworks that affected me deeply. And this book began as an attempt to capture the really profound impression and the intensity of the responses that those artworks left with me and forced me to grapple with. And a Black gaze is the term that I came up with to account for these responses and the intensity of them. It describes not necessarily a perspective, so to speak, but more about how these particular artworks position us, not only in relationship to the works themselves, but in relationship to how we see our society and how we see our circumstances. And it is a positioning that, as I argue in the book, demands a kind of active responsiveness, and the kind of active responsiveness that I was trying to write through. And so that's why I wrote the book, to give an account of these effects and to give an account of them as being both about the work itself, but also about something larger that exceeds the work, which the work is able to channel and amplify. And the second question that I got over and over again about why write it now is a question that I've come to really articulate as about the difficulty of this moment in which we're living. I believe that there's really important work that we need to do that demands that we embrace the difficulty of the positioning that the artwork of some extraordinary artists enforces us to take up. It is work of embracing discomfort, disorientation, and that the embrace of that and the working through of that discomfort and disorientation, those challenges and those confrontations, helps us to see each other and ourselves differently. I am convinced that Black artists in particular are helping us to do that work in profound ways. And they are challenging us to sit with that work and to think about where it can take us. So I'm going to give you a taste of what that looks like in the book, or what that feels like, or what that sounds like in the book, by reading an excerpt from what functions as the introduction, which I call a prelude to a Black gaze. And as Mabel mentioned, the book is comprised of not necessarily 7 chapters, although they function in that way organizationally. I call them verses. I call them verses because my intention is not so much to analyze the works that I engage in them, but to try and express them and to give an expression to the responses and the responsiveness that I feel that they demand. So I'm going to read a section of the prelude where I talk about a short video made by the filmmaker whose work really did initially inspire me to think about something called a Black gaze in the first place. And that filmmaker is Arthur Jafa. It's a video some of you may be familiar with. It's the video for the song 444 by Jay-Z. I am not going to screen it for you, but it is available on Vimeo, so you can do that. So I'm going to ask to share the screen with some images, and we'll go from there. There we go. A silent serenade between Jay-Z and Beyonce, live on stage. Singing, serenading, flirting. It's sassy, it's sensual. She teases, he taunts, they both tantalize. She loves it, and he clearly loves her for it, and we are captivated by their exchange of smiles and glances and her twirls around and around him, layered over the sweet signature whisper of Al Green, cooing his love song, come lullaby, Judy. The footage is grainy, but its texture has nothing to do with age. Its grain comes from its visual frequency, which filmmakers, editors, and cinematographers commonly refer to as frame rate. In this case, it is intentionally slowed frame rate that reveals the tender relations of both the scene and its subjects. This grainy, slow motion clip gives an intimate framing to one of the most public Black couples on the planet. Next slide. The sequence spans only a few seconds, but it feels far longer. Then it erupts to inject live concert audio of call and response, with Queen Bee stoking the audience's collective refrain. But this tantalizing scene is preceded by shattering footage. Film footage, culled from Birth of a Nation, toggles between cell phone footage of a Black man being beaten by a scrum of white police and CCTV footage showing a car mowing down a Black bystander in a parking lot. Interwoven amongst them is additional footage, cell phone video captured by ordinary people of street scenes, parties, and dances, drawn from an endless archive of found footage posted on various online sites. Next slide. A cell phone video captures a prepubescent boy belting out the lyrics to Nina Simone's signature rendition of Feeling Good, with the vibrato of a 60-something blues singer seated in the back seat of a moving vehicle. It transitions to hyper-pixelated footage of Eartha Kitt mid-soliloquy, waxing characteristically defiant, poetic, and dismissive of love and relationships. Silent portraits of two Black feminist theorists flicker briefly between these and other unlikely scenes, leaving unanswered questions in their lingering shadows. And a bleach blonde Black man filmed against a blindingly white background bears witness to hearing the voice of the Almighty speak to him in the moment of his temporary death after taking a bullet. He recounts his reflections with the wisdom of a shaman and the charm of a playa. The video for Jay-Z's 444, released in 2017, is chock full of love and loss, beauty and brutality, Black pleasure and Black precarity. Although produced as a visual and commercial vehicle for the song, the video is in no way beholden to it. It is a work that inverts the relationship between image and song by transforming the music into a vehicle for the astonishing montage of images created by Arthur Jafa and the T-Neg Collective. It coalesces around a series of visual duets that intertwine pleasure and despair and juxtapose the extremities of Black life in the 21st century. We see these extremities through the intentionally grainy frame of Jafa's cinematic lens. It is a grain that emerges when the diminutive frame of cell phone video is expanded to a much larger screen. But it is also a grain that we feel as much as we see it. We feel the rough, unfocused grain produced by zooming in for a hyper close-up on a cell or CCTV footage of a beating or a drive-by. We feel the grain of a zoom in that allows us to appreciate the artistry of an impromptu subway performance, an improvised dance at a party, or a backseat solo performance. We feel it in the halo-like blur that results when a master cinematographer shows us the power of the everyday visualizing practices of ordinary Black folks' amateur videos. They are videos that allow us to see ourselves as discerning and uncompromising witnesses who adamantly refuse to look away. 444 whiplashes us between giggles and gasps, between winces and sighs, yet what weaves the emotional extremes of this 8-minute collage together and connects the mosaic of clips it gathers to the lyrical apology Jay-Z professes in the song is a breathtaking physical duet created by the coordinated sinews of flesh and muscle of two extraordinary movement artists, acclaimed flex dancer Storyboard P and MacArthur award-winning movement artist Okwui Okpokwasili. Next slide, please. The two did not rehearse prior to the take included in the video. They were asked instead to dance simultaneously in tandem. They never touch, but there is contact nonetheless. What emerges is an organic symbiosis and a spontaneous interaction. The correlation of their bodies is something more than a dance and more than a choreography. It is a corporeal negotiation of intimacy, distance, tenderness, and rage. Storyboard and Okwui Okpokwasili's fleshly improvisation mirrors the emotional apology that is the dominating lyric of 444. Placed in the context of the larger screen of visual duets it gathers, the video offers a different kind of mirror. It is a mirror on Black sociality. It is a mirror that reflects and refracts an uncomfortable portrait of Black life in the US at a moment when its most stunning and honest visualizations are those that twin the joys of the Black quotidian with the pain of Black precarity. The video captures Okpokwasili running languidly, then fluidly, at times seeming as if she is about to launch into flight. But most of the time she remains in place, vibrating intensely. Her body ripples, her neck rolls. She appears to rotate on her own axis. She undulates at a distance from storyboard, then grazes him closely. She turns away, then faces off in a confrontation that pivots back and forth between aggression and intimacy, conflict and vulnerability, apprehension and deep affection. As storyboard passes behind, alongside, or in front of her, the motion of his body suspends time and seems to deny the physics of the corporeal relationship between skeleton and flesh. He moves neither vertically nor horizontally. His body flows like a viscous material that mediates solid and liquid. He flows, she flows. And as I argue in the chapters that follow, Black flow is creating a radical Black gaze, or put another way, we flow. Watching 444 isn't easy. It doesn't tell a story. It narrates neither the lyric of the song nor the sexy hip hop life of bubbles and bling. You have to work to understand the connections between its various clips and sequences. I get goosebumps every time I listen to the vibrato of that young boy singing in the backseat of a car. It's chilling to watch a scene of a Black boy on an auction block culled from Birth of a Nation. It hurts to watch video footage of police officers' relentless abuse of a Black man spliced so seamlessly into clips of parties and concerts. And it is harrowing to watch a body bounce off the hood of a moving car, careening around a corner, intentionally hitting a bystander. But 444 is a video we both want and need to see. Its beauty and its power is that it requires us to be present. Watching it requires us to cycle through discomfort in order to appreciate its moments of sublime reverie. Reverie in Black love, in Black survival, and a future we were never promised, yet claim and cling to vigorously and vociferously. It's a discomforting, aspirational Black gaze. Next slide, please. This book sketches the contours of this emergent Black gaze, focusing on a group of artists whose creative practice produces radical forms of witnessing that reject traditional ways of seeing Blackness, ways of seeing that historically depict Blackness only in a subordinate relationship to whiteness. What defines and unites their divergent practice is their ability to make audiences work. They refuse to create spectators, as it is neither easy nor possible, actually, to passively consume their art. Their work requires labor, the labor of discomfort, feeling, positioning, and repositioning, and solicits visceral responses to the visualization of Black precarity. This book asks us to consider what kind of work these artists ask us to do and what kind of labor it requires of us. Posing these questions means asking what is at stake in their work, as well as what are the stakes of creating this particular kind of art. My answer to these artworks demands a different kind of response. My answer to that is that these artworks demand a different kind of response, or more precisely, a particular kind of responsiveness. They insist that we actively inhabit states ranging from disorientation and unease to implication and vulnerability, and that we work through these responses to come out somewhere new and important. They demand a recognition that we are implicated in the precarity of Black life in the contemporary moment, and in embracing or refusing this implication, we are faced with a choice: act or be complicit. It is a recognition that requires us to develop a different way of engaging art by way of a Black gaze that mandates our participation in and interaction with the social and political questions these works raise in ways that leave us vulnerable to their effects, but better off for it. Thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Tina. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I prepared some brief remarks, and then I have kind of two questions. So I'll begin first with thanks to Tina and to Mabel, to IRAS, to AAADS, to Jack, to Sharon, and to the ASL interpreters for all of the work that you're doing. And also thanks to Tavia and to Michael. It's good to be with you as well. So in a conversation several months ago with Kimberly Drew, and in the aftermath of many murders of Black people by police and those who are otherwise deputized by whiteness, Drew asked you, Tina, a question about compassion fatigue, to which you responded that you were writing against that very notion. And you said something along the lines of, there's a lot to be exhausted about, but not feeling, end quote. And feeling is not empathy, but it is or may be attention and or implication. So in the news today, yesterday, the day before, Black and brown people are being beaten, told to walk, segregated, pulled off trains and buses, stopped at the border, and not allowed to flee the Ukraine. They're being terrorized in Poland, and we see them turning toward each other in being present. And I find myself unable to adequately speak to where we find ourselves now, but I wanted to mark it, and I want to suggest that your work and method and practice helps us not to look away, that helps us to think about what is and what might be at stake, and what would have had to be made or happen in order to survive this. You write, quote, "The future real conditional for that which will have had to happen is proceeding as if conditional or that which, is proceeding as if. It proceeds as if our aspirations were being or had already been realized. It is a radical provocation to see Blackness differently, and in so doing to create a path to living Blackness differently, not in the future, but now," end quote. And so to return to your conversation with Kimberly Drew, she spoke of a Black gaze as doing the work of feeling across differences. And she said that that work is a labor of feeling. And I thought, yes, thinking and feeling across differences. It's the work of, quote, risking something, as Ronaldo Walcott argues. And it seems even more urgent in these days of expanding war and the present and coming and perhaps haltable, quote, atlas of suffering brought on by continued and accelerated resource extraction in the face of collapsing ecosystems. But this requires presence. This halting requires presence at the very least. And in a Black gaze, you enact a required presence and implication in the precarity of Black life. And you've said that these verses insist, and you just read, act or be complicit. I teach a Black gaze and listening to images, and I've been teaching from both this semester, and of course I'm teaching on Blackness and visual culture. And it's been necessary and good to return to and tarry with these works that speak to each other, and to your continued attention to images, your invitations to join, and your provocations to listen and be with or alongside, and to do the work of attending to, being attentive to, formally and otherwise challenging work that shows or incorporates, requires and refuses the figure. Likewise, the meaning that accumulates to words, phrases, frequencies, like your father's humming, that introduces the throat-clearing gesture of the introduction to listening to images, and returns throughout this book, but most fully perhaps in the slow lives of still moving images. And it's a book that I continue to work through, to cite and to think with and teach. And it strikes me that like the best work, each time I read the entire book or a verse, I land somewhere else, some other aperture opens, or something else, some new set of words and phrases and feelings register and resonate. And I wanted to offer a few: invitation, provocation, seeing and feeling, witness as a refusal to look away, correlation, grain, tenderness, hapticity, tension, implication, improvisation, Black sociality, Black quotidian, Black precarity, slowness, quiet, reflection, juxtaposition, velocity, gravity's downward pull, assembly, collaboration, the time it takes to hear one's own breath, the movement of air, still moving, required presence. And we stay with you as you ask what kind of work these artists ask us to do and what kind of labor is required of us, what is at stake and what are the stakes. And you propose and take us through multiple ways of engaging work, not art critically or art historically, but by working through and toward what is required of the I, subject, I, vision, and I, affirmative response. The requirement is one of labor, of showing up, of sitting with, of being touched. To show up as witness to, and maybe at times participant in, Black life in all of its complexity. This is, or these are, particular and varied kinds of responsiveness toward the possibility, as you say, of some new thing to recognize and reckon with. And this may also be the labor of discomfort as critical practice, as an embodied sensory practice, also of what we bring into the room with us. This practice of engaging art as a kind of amplification shifts what it does or what it might mean for any of us or for all of us to bring our bodies into the space, to bring our experience into the space. And then you talk about not wanting to relinquish a term, gaze, which you invest with other meanings as structural, as a structure of visual engagement, multiple, polyvalent. And a Black gaze in your formulation really does say, try to look, try to see, which also means try to hear, which also means feel. Black labor and the labor of Black artists, struggle and tense and aliveness and joy and refusal in and of Black life, the sonic, the haptic, the optic, quote, the creativity, ingenuity, cunning, and courage that allow us to acknowledge the forces that would define us, and yet not succumb to that definition, is the modus operandi of a Black gaze, end quote. And finally, you say in an interview, which I can't now remember with who, but it might be with Sarah Lewis, I don't want my readers to labor over the content of what I'm trying to say. I want them to labor over the affect of understanding that content. It's that I will invite you into a place where you may be uncomfortable and you may have to work, but it's not because the door is too hard to get open. It's because you got into that room and you looked around and you're like, shit, this is hard, end quote. These encounters that require work, labor, yes, because presence is not easy. Those are my comments. And then I had two kind of half-formed invitations questions. And the first is about hapticity. And that is, what does this sustain, and it's for all of us, not just for you, the question. What does this sustaining work of hapticity look like? How are relationships sustained across position through this kind of work? What is this work's frequency? And the second question is really that I really want to keep thinking with grain and deep Blackness, with Black grain. You know, grain as texture, the haptic, the sonic, the visual, but grain in its archaic definition also equals color or tint. So it's like black, black. What is it to feel that and to work with and stay with that black grain? And so I was thinking of Tavia and euchromia. Black is what determines color rather than what limits it. And Michel and the aesthetic and critical practices of Black film. So those are my thoughts and my two invitations.
I can jump in at this point since I'm on screen. I also want to repeat all the thanks that Christina just gave. I'm so happy to be here and to be, I was going to, absorbing and reabsorbing the gift of Tina Campt's A Black Gaze, which I'm also teaching this semester, and some of my students are here, and we're what Tina said earlier about well, not doing analysis but expression. I think there's actually some great analysis in here too, but I know what you mean in terms of setting up a kind of sort of two-way street between the way in which art thinks and the way critics and scholars think about the art, right? Rather than having one be set up as the as the interpretive authority over the other, as your opening reading just really beautifully exemplified how not only AJ's work, but also the work of all the named and unnamed Black contributors to his curated archive, and are producing thought, right? Producing the kind of the kind of gaze that you've given us this wonderful articulation of. I organized my thoughts in preparation for this in the form of sort of three areas that I have, three of many areas that I could, I had to pick three in the interest of time, I suppose. And the first has to do with the concept of adjacency and the way you write about adjacency, in particular in relation to the work of Luke Willis Thompson and his auto-portrait of Diamond Reynolds, and your particularly precise and difficult response to the accusation of aestheticizing Black pain, right? And how by taking us in and through a close description of your encounter with the work, I mean, literally your encounter, walking into the room and all the work involved, the labor involved in seeing, right? But also what you don't get to see, right? You invite your reader to not to have, rather than having this sort of hot take, but without, what I also appreciate about the concept of adjacency is it is, rather than shutting down the emotional or affective reaction, right, to a difficult piece of work or a difficult set of relations between a photographer and a sitter, you actually insist upon that, right? And that the gift of the idea of a poetics of care is not one in which we work through dismissing difficult feelings, but learning how to sit with them. And that art and the aesthetic is not simply, it can't, well, it is often beautiful. We have to deal with the charged beauty of that. But even in the kind of dialectic of beauty and precarity, we're learning something different about what I kind of left the chapter in the book thinking about how adjacency offers us a thicker and more rich way of approaching some of these questions than like say allyship does, right? That we have a kind of a shorthand, right? But it doesn't really, in part because adjacency is all about a refusal to be complicit in silence, right? So part of it's that refusal of complicity which is so important, and that the ultimately, I mean, maybe the question is how to think with you about how adjacency produces a relationship between a Black gaze and Black viewers, Black critics, Black artists that is not necessarily one-to-one, right? We're not just, moving around the world, bearing the Black gaze, but that a Black gaze is a call to a certain kind of responsibility, and the conviction that the book has, which is really, really timely and resonant with so many other in all the directions I turn, right, is that this is a moment in which Black art is striving and succeeding in being responsible to the moment in a way that almost few other forms are, right? I don't know if that's our burden. Why is it our burden to be responsible to the moment? Nevertheless, there does seem to be something really incredible and needed about excavating how that is working, right? And which leads me to the second sort of theme, which Christina touched upon, which is, and you mentioned at the opening, which is precarity. And all I want to say there is that your book takes precarity as a major theme, but you come at it in a different way than any other writer on precarity that I've read prior, and that is in part because precarity is often either not given a direct image, right, or the image is represented in terms of like a fragile or an exhausted or a traumatized body, which is part of precarity, but the images of Black precarity or the Black image of precarity is so often engaged in a kind of dialectical or dialogic reversal or refusal of that iconography, and an invention of I'm actually thinking about Storyboard P and Okwi's dance, right? That in that dialogue with precarity, something other than exhaustion or depletion is insisted upon, and that it's not simply a question of expressing an arbitrary preference for life or joy or exuberance, but a deeper question of how Black gaze on precarity shifts how we see it, how we feel it, and how we dream beyond it, which is also to dream within it. Because we are also, as Christina's work, I'm thinking always of how we're entangled in relationships of precarity, right? We don't really have a place outside of it, right? And nonetheless, we breathe, we live, we create art, right? And so the question, which is maybe I'm answering in my own, but like how you see the insights of this work intervening in this broader conversation around precarity, if that's in fact I think one of the potential lessons or ramifications of the work, right, is to have and then maybe that's actually maybe attached to your sort of long investment in the quotidian and I don't want to say the elevation of the quotidian into something, but rather the insistence that quotidian Black image makers and images are themselves that must be seen as a resource for the kind of thinking and response and refusal of the conditions of anti-Blackness. Yeah, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
I do. Okay. I mean, because you guys have put so much on the table that I want to hear you talk back to me about, which is one of the things that you pick up on really beautifully, Christina, is that this book is fundamentally about a dialogue, about creating the possibility of a conversation, right? And creating the possibility of an active conversation that's not easy. And that, like I said at the beginning of my comment, is that there is a way in which I was transcribing a conversation that was going on in my head in response to a lot of these works, but it was also a conversation that was in dialogue with your works, just literally your works. And for me, Tavia, when you're talking about the question of adjacency and the way in which I am approaching precarity, there is a profound recognition that has come sort of since writing the book, that as much as I thought that much of what I was writing was responding to the precarity produced by violence, by the relentless violence of anti-Blackness that you're also referencing, Christina, I realized that I am most profoundly responding to grief, right? Most profoundly responding to the sort of sedimentation of like histories upon histories of grief. And that is for me, the more unbearable thing is to recognize a confrontation with what we have lost or what has been taken away from us. And that the labor of that is not the labor of opposition, right? It is the labor of both refusing to relinquish that and at the same time insisting that everybody do the work of collective grief as grievance. And that the collective grief as grievance is terrifyingly difficult, And that's the point that I find most poignantly made, Christina, by that beautiful sentence that I quote from you of to recognize the ways that we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to overwhelming force, though not only known to ourselves and to each other by that force. So how can we think about, or how can we engage the constitutive force of that, of negation, right? And yet not allow that constitutive force to be the only way through which we understand ourselves, right? So to be constitutive but not constituted by, and to be able to make a distinction between those two things that allows us to be enlivened by, right? To be enlivened through the precarity that structures much of our everyday experiences. And that's a conundrum that I found was threaded through all the work that I was writing about or responding to, is, to be constituted by this, but to be constitutive of our existence, but we will not be constituted by it. And I think that's a challenge that all of you, right, that we all write towards in different ways. And to be able to simply put it, to think of it as a structure of witnessing that challenges us to go beyond simply seeing or to simply, naming. That was the challenge that I was actually trying to rise to, inspired by the ways in which you guys do it.
Just to jump in here a little bit. In a lot of ways, I thought it's really too soon for me to talk about your book. I'm still very much processing your incredible opening to the Flaherty seminar in August.
Yeah.
Your just absolutely stunning conversation with Garrett Bradley. But I'm particularly still processing walking into a darkened room after having not seen anyone for about a year, anyone to spontaneously run into someone, and to see someone so intensely looking at a screen in a darkened space and looking at the back of your head at the Grief and Grievance show while you were watching Kahlil Joseph's Black Mary. And really,
I was wearing a neck brace too.
Yeah, I wasn't going to put all your business in the street, but yeah, you were looking a little broke. But yeah, there was a neck brace involved, but it was still someone familiar.
Yeah.
But it was just drawn to the intensity with which you were watching the screen, which I thought a great deal about today in terms of the tone and the style of a Black gaze, which to me, the terms that quite immediately came to mind were care, rigor, and a relentless attention to your study. There's a moment early on in the book, which for me was quite crucial, which became a way of understanding your remediation of the Lacanian, your remediation of Mulvey, Diawara, and bell hooks. When you write, I'm proposing that we think about a Black gaze rather than the Black gaze, and understand it as both multiple and polyvalent. It is at once a critical framework, a reading apparatus, a term that describes an artist's practice, and a spectatorial meditation that demands particularly active modes of watching, listening, and witnessing. And that for me was an incredible invitation to understand that your conception of the gaze was so vigilantly attentive to witnessing and understanding our complicities, particularly around questions of the art of Blackness and our understanding of historiography. I was also thinking a great deal about the way that Baldwin talks about rather cheekily talks about the idea of the touch in his work in The Devil Finds Work. So within your book, you're staging so many encounters about the requirement of work. Work that entails more than address of content, but also it entails a deep inquiry of the consequences of form and movement with and through the art of Blackness, as well as Black precarity and the intimacies and ambiguities of Black sociality. I mean, for example, today is March 3rd. 33 years ago, De La Soul dropped 3 feet high and rising. And 31 years ago, Rodney King was beaten. In many ways, March 3rd should indeed be a holiday. I'll take that over Juneteenth. But it's your critical narration throughout which resists any tendency that might suspend the animacy of the art and the work. Your readings are generative and expansive inquiries that demonstrate a rich adjacency and resonance. You implicate yourself in your process of reading and understanding and thinking. And in this way, your readings are they're acts of world making, acts of Black making, a brilliant attention to frequencies, to the frequencies of Black visual and expressive culture. In this way, I locate much of this work as vital study, a vital Black study of objects, aesthetics, and kinship. So in that way, I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful to celebrate you, but I still think it's too soon. I still just want to sit in a room and see you watching a film. So thank you.
Oh, you're so, oh, I need to thank you. I mean, the encounter that Michael is describing was shortly after I had cervical disc replaced in my neck, and that was a moment. The Grief and Grievance exhibition was the first time I had actually been able to see art in situ since the pandemic, and so I really was in a corner in a dark room, intensely consuming Kahlil's work. Black Mary, wasn't it? It was Black Mary.
It was Black Mary. It was like, who's that
Yeah.
contortionist in the corner? And then I was like, oh, shit, that's Tina. And so, yeah.
But I mean, it is also that it was, I think that Grief and Grievance was that moment for so many of us. It was the first time that a lot of us could go back into a gallery, or we dared to go back into a gallery, and it was Grief and Grievance. It was a collective moment of grief and of grievance, both for what we were experiencing as well as for this, extraordinary vision that was Okwui and Wizor's, vision re-realized, finally realized. And it was the intensity of being able to inhabit the power of art, right? To literally physically inhabit it the way in which it was installed in all of its intensity, because that was the other thing. It was all these things, quite literally proximate to one another. And it was one horrible, one intensely, moving experience after the next. But, oh, Michael. I mean, the other thing about the multiplicity that you were describing is you prompted me to actually articulate what a Black gaze was as multiple. And I have to say, I'm grateful to you for those kind of prompts. Tavia, did you want to say something? You're about to.
Oh, no, I just had a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think it kind of follows from, your dialogue with Michael just now, but also from the first question that you were asked, which is, why did you write the book? Which I think is a weird question, just for the record, but like, I imagine, why did you write this book? I wanted to ask, it's a weird question to ask the author, right? Why did you write this book this way? Because I think we've all been sort of alluding to the real, I don't want to call it an experiment, but innovation in form, right? The turn to the verse rather than the chapter, the use of personal travelogue in order to move us through your encounters with art. And the reason I'm asking the question is it does, again, seem to me like there's a real need at the moment for more for a multiplicity of approaches to talking about the work, not only because of the sort of really kind of efflorescence of work, but also because so many of the existing ways in which art gets described and Black art gets described are so many ways kind of exhausted or like insufficient to this moment. So it's just like a how a Black gaze is helping us take up the measure of this moment.
Right. I mean, I think that the why write it this way is the intentional part. I will say that is extremely intentional. And it is about, enacting the practice of being alongside, right? So what does it mean to not look at, but to look alongside and to position yourself in relationship? And as well, to also be able to think about that proximity as opening oneself up to questions, to complicity, to implication, and in doing that, to create a space to do what you're talking about, which is to not rest in comfortable modes of narration, right? There was the intention of like of staging certain kinds of conversation. So there is a conversation between the image and how it is placed in relationship to text that's writing, that's addressing it, right? And so there is a way in which I wanted to be able to address artwork that wasn't about writing over it, right? So to be able to always, I mean, who was it? I think it was some of my students who were asking me about why I wrote the way I wrote. And I said, because I wanted it not just to be a conversation, but a potential argument, so that you can argue with me, so you can tell me that I'm wrong, so that you can tell me, but in doing that, I'm activating a different kind of relationship, and not trying to mediate or triangulate a relationship between myself, a reader or a viewer, and the work. I'm just asking you to be in this conversation. And that conversation can lead to very, very different places. I mean, there are a lot of people who diverge dramatically on how I think about Deana Lawson's work. There are a lot of people who take great exception. There are a lot of people who take great exception at how I engage Luke Willis Thompson's work. And I'm not saying that I am right. I'm saying that I feel like there's an opportunity to think about our responses to those works that might be extremely divergent, but they do something. They do something. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the responses to Deana Lawson's work, and not because I think they're all wrong, but because a lot of the negative criticism of it, I recognize it, right? I recognize the ways in which Black respectability will come creeping up when you least expect it, right? Like, you know, the desire for an accountability to what we do, what we will and won't let folks see about us. And that is so familiar to me. And yet I also want to be able to talk about that. I really want to have a conversation about, you know, the way in which I am haunted by the forms of Black respectability that have policed me all my life. So yeah. That part I can say was deeply intentional, and also deeply inspired by those who take chances with how they write. You know, those who put themselves at risk. You know, what you cited, Christina, in Ronaldo's work. You know, how do you put yourself at risk? What are the stakes of writing the way you write? And I think that the work takes risks, and so I had to take some risks as well. I think we all do.
Just to, you know, thanks so much for that. I mean, you know, the first thought that kind of came to mind was that, you know, in terms of these tendencies that you're speaking about, you know, sometimes you'll read some kind of criticism about the art of Blackness, and it feels as though you're reading an autopsy. I mean, it in no way enlivens the work or understands that there is definitely a kind of effective labor that's necessary in our encounter with the arts. And that's why it's such a pleasure and joy to kind of track the way that you are indeed implicating yourself throughout. It takes a great deal of labor to do the kind of writing that you're doing. And I'm just grateful that you have the patience and the discipline to do it.
Well, I have to say that I have a certain gratitude in listening and being able to sort of feed back, right? And so there, I want you to say more about the art of Blackness. I mean, that's such a gorgeous turn of phrase, but it's also meaningful. And you've referenced it a few times, and I want to hear you talk about what that reference helps us to do, because I think it helps us to do a number of different things.
Okay. this was not in the email, okay?
No,
no.
but the conversation.
Really, the art of Blackness comes out of Black One Shot. It was, you know,
a lot of folks hadn't read the whole thing.
yeah. I mean, it became, you know, at some point we began, you know, Lisa Udine and I began to realize that we weren't necessarily, that the category, the idea of Black art wasn't really speaking to what we were doing or what we wanted to do. And always kind of pulling out Black visual and expressive cultures, the phrasing that wasn't doing it as well. And so we settled on art of Blackness for that. And that's how now I just begin to gravitate towards work such as your own that helps to organize my thoughts. And again, makes me commit to doing studies rather than doing autopsies when it comes to thinking about art.
But at the same time, it also gives us a different lexicon for doing that work, right? And so that's one of the reasons I wanted you to be able to say that to this audience of, you know, what does it mean to have a different lexicon for talking about the work we're talking about? That is not autopsies. That is not about exhumation, right?
Or vivisection.
Or vivisection, right? Yeah, and we don't have enough. I mean, that was the other thing that I, you know, this is something Christina and I share is, you know, what does it mean to annotate? It means to build a broader, more capacious lexicon that will allow us to account for the complexity of Black life in relationship to anti-Blackness at a completely different frequential register, right? But it has to be marked. It has to be claimed. Otherwise, you know, we have recourse to a very limited set of vocabulary. And that vocabulary is not alive. That vocabulary is flat and inert. Go ahead.
No, I'm waiting for Christina to say something.
I was going to go back to the question that I asked because it seemed like it worked in that moment, but maybe we've answered it, and that was the question. I'll read the quote, which is, "Hapticity is in this sense the labor of feeling beyond the security of one's own situation. It involves cultivating an ability to confront the precarity of less valued or actively devalued individuals without guarantees, and working to sustain a relationship to those imperiled and precarious bodies nonetheless. It's a labor of love required to feel across different precarity, implication, and suffering." And so I wondered what we thought that sustaining work of hapticity sort of looked and felt and sounded like. Like how would we think with this, and how our relationship sustained across position through this kind of work, and again, what's the frequency of this work? But maybe you've answered that.
I mean, I think it has to do with the question that we've all referenced, which is, what does it mean to care, right? What does care mean when it is not a passive adverb, right? Or a passive verb. When working to bridge a gap or to bridge the disparity of one's positioning, you know, all that means to me is to care, right? To care in an active way that acknowledges that some have more than others ever will possibly have, right? Could ever possibly imagine. And yet, to be able to work towards the ownership of that and the transformation of it. And that's the part, is the work is the transformation. and that I do believe that that's the only way that's possible. I mean, it's the other thing that, I mean, when you quoted that comment of mine from that interview, and I cannot remember with whom I did that interview, but I do remember that person got me to say really smart things, and I was like, yay. Yes, this is the most exhausting moment I have ever lived. And what we want to do is we want to not feel. But that's the thing that is the most necessary to get beyond this moment of exhaustion.
That was with Kimberly Drew.
That was with, oh, she did. She was amazing. I kept thinking, but again, that was really, we cannot be exhausted.
Yeah.
With
you said something about then that's not compassion if it's if it's fatigue. But can I just say one other thing? This is totally different, which is that I so love the chapter, what is it, the chapter that moves from Okwui to Dawoud. I mean, the sort of flow of that, the movement from, that sort of suspension and imperceptible but movement that is still moving, and that phrase that I quoted, that just sort of carries through everything, which is the time it takes to hear one's breath, because that's so much of what I hear when I listen to Dawoud Bey's Night Coming Tenderly Black, is the breathing of those people who made their way across that water, through those woods, up to that porch, etc. And so I want to thank you for the sort of beautiful work of that verse.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I see Mabel and Jack joining us in conversation. Hey.
I just wanted to shout out your reading of Madeline Holt Ulrich's Spit on the Broom. The degree, when you begin to almost kind of introduce this synesthetic quality to Blackness, where you start employing these ideas of the choral to talk about the kind of visual arrangement and organization of the film. To me, it became like a stunning way to understand our training, our investments, isn't really towards, or should not be towards necessarily mastery in the classical sense, but more about an attunement to the objects in which we are willing to invest our time and attention to. So thank you so much for that, because I love that film.
I love that film, and that film was one of those, that particular, I mean, what you just said is actually my entire approach to engaging contemporary art, which is, what if we relinquish mastery? To me, that's part of what a Black gaze is. What if we relinquish mastery as our point of reference, and instead dedicate ourselves to attunement? I think that is what artists are actually demanding of us. And rising to that challenge, our go-to is mastery. But that go-to is a particular interpretation or a particular inhabitation of a gaze that has nothing to do with whiteness or Blackness. But a gaze is always already about, aspiring to mastery. But that's what I'm trying to do with the Black gaze, is to say, what if we relinquished mastery? What kind of ways of inhabiting the practice of looking might we open up, and where might that take us?
God help us if pleasure and form actually comes in the conversation.
This has been such a beautiful conversation. We do have one question. I selfishly, Tina, want to ask you more about the Deana Lawson. I thought that was a great moment when you were saying, not everyone might agree with your readings, and I think there's something there that we might want to unpack. That you're looking at images that are read as very complicated in relationship to the project of representing Black life in all of its glory, but some of these images sort of traffic in messiness
Mhm.
and in ways that are, I think, fascinating and brilliant. But there's a tendency to want to decide between, you know, condemnation or something else. And I think that that something else is partly a method that you're laying out for us in the book that I found very helpful, you know, in thinking about the Deana Lawson. So I kind of wanted to ask you a bit more about that, but I do want to draw your attention as well to a question that has been posed by Kavita Kulkarni, who wants to ask you about your experience of writing about art here versus your experience of writing about vernacular photography in your last book, or archival images. And she's saying, besides the research process, was there anything that felt really different in terms of these two projects as a scholar or a writer?
You know what, it's more what felt familiar. What felt familiar was the was exactly what we were just talking about like pushing myself to relinquish mastery as the point, as my starting point of reference. And I had to do that with vernacular photography each and every time, right? So starting from, so in Image Matters, where it was about family photography, where people tell us that family photography says nothing, right? And so the first thing I tried to do when I started, you know, writing about family photography was to try and master what its formal structures are. And mastering those formal structures got me nowhere other than a description, right? And a description of similarity. And that description of similarity, however, took me to another place of why is it that things that that have a formal structure that seems repetitive are seen as, you know, not valuable or not aesthetic, right? Or not, and having no sort of effective power or scholarly insights. And the same thing was the case in relationship to identification photography, where again we are taught that for me it's always the embrace of studium rather than punctum, right? So what does it mean to actually say I'm into studium? The studium can actually tell us something really revelatory, as opposed to always, you know, staying at, you know, a classical Barthian approach to any kind of visual object. And so coming to contemporary art was a similar, okay, is my first path to go towards how do these works resonate in relationship to a genre, right, or a medium, and to sort of go backwards into that, or to go forwards and say, no, I'm not going to start with mastery. I'm going to start with attunement. And what can I get from that? Or what does it tell me about these works? And what do these works tell us about a larger, you know, a larger set of social relations if we think about attunement? So I would say that writing about contemporary art is far scarier because the stakes are far higher, because people's investments are far more well articulated, because nobody's really, you know, people are grateful when you elevate the mundane forms of vernacular photography towards something that is seen as having either aesthetic value or scholarly value. That territory is well defended in contemporary art, and to put yourself in that conversation is to actually make yourself vulnerable. So that was the risk that I took, but I felt like it was worth a risk that was worth taking. But also then to the selfish question, Jack, which was, I love the messy, I love the messy. We learned so much from the messy. And I was in I did a conversation with Deana Lawson at ICA Boston, where I actually asked the question to her, and I posed the question of, if the author of the hyperallergic piece that was so critical of her work were to have come to her and asked her before she wrote and published the piece about the questions that she had about well, she didn't call it respectability, but respectability and all these other things, what would she have said if she had been asked in advance? And she had, to me, a beautiful answer. She's like, I've never been drawn to things like that. I'm drawn to the messiness of Black life. I really want to be accountable to the things that we don't want to talk about. I want to actually engage that. And I thought that was the most honest and valuable answer one could ever give, which is, okay, what if that's not my investment, is in skirting around the controversial? What if I want to put that in our faces so that we can have a conversation about it, where we expose what our stakes are around that? And I feel like that's also what those critiques do, is they expose what the stakes are for us about being seen in all of our, right, in all our terribleness, very baraka, or in our terrible beauty. But that terribleness, I think, is part of Deana's genius, right? Her capacity to capture and inhabit our terribleness.
Yeah, I hear you. That's so great. It's also, there's a way in which people just read the photographs as if they're somehow documentaries, as opposed to highly staged, highly fabricated images where the messiness is actually part of the staging. It's not some verite shot.
Yeah.
Abel,
Michael,
did you want to? I didn't know.
Michael actually wanted to say something
Michael.
too.
Yeah. I just wanted to add to that. I mean, thank you for putting it that way, Tina, because I really love the ambivalence of her practice, and particularly the beauty in the recent work, the work that's with where the print is distressed, or it has those kind of 3D holograms within it. I need more of that, and as much as I need more ambivalence in the art world in general, but I especially would love to have more of that from her.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, Michael, with it. Those were the works that I was the most fascinated by from Deana Lawson. And I just want to say thank you again, Tina, for a really a remarkable conversation today. But again, the ways in which you set up a kind of critical practice, right? Because I think you're really challenging these institutions that posit objective knowledge, posit connoisseurship, ways of possessing the work, that we're supposed to emulate. And you really write yourself into these spaces in dialogue with the artist, in dialogue with the work, but also with us as the reader. I literally felt like I was in dialogue with you, sometimes wanting to argue with you, that it's not, but that it's not. I mean, I agree. I mean, that one could contest what you're saying, but I think you open it up, right, for that. And I think that's really important. And I think that becomes a different way of engaging these works that are outside of that, it's singular and, almost extract it from the context in which it is lived, seen, and made. And I think that's so problematic of just the art world in general and the ways in which the histories of art construct it. So we do have one more question. Should we take it or should we?
Sure.
Okay. So one more question from Jonathan Payne, who asks, I'm curious about the Black gaze being aligned with the rejection of mastery as we understand it as a white supremacist and elitist engagement. Do you believe Black mastery exists? And if so, can it formally, conceptually exist outside of the oppressive dominant systems? What is a better way of describing the formalism of Blackness beyond mastery?
I so want to hear everybody else's and particularly Michael's take on this. I mean, on the one hand, mastery, the term master and mastery is a structure that Black folks haven't had a lot of access to. But it's also about, it is a declaration of comprehensiveness, that there is nothing more to be said, right? That there is a take that is being imposed upon and being judged to be comprehensive. And so I don't know what Black mastery would look like, right? Would that be because the sort of the art of Blackness is improvisational, right? Is about the creation of possibility, is about a responsiveness that has to always be nimble. So I don't know what Black mastery would look like. I don't know what the formalism of Blackness beyond mastery would be. So maybe that's an overly optimistic or Pollyanna-ish way of understanding the question, but it is not a set of terms that I can necessarily think together. I feel like we have been forced to relinquish mastery because it doesn't necessarily get us somewhere. Where does it get us? But I don't know. Christina, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I necessarily understand the question, but I'm just thinking, I think we perhaps see Black mastery in places outside of North America, or something like that. I'm not certain, but is it something that is Black mastery something that we want to see? Certainly I think you've already said that, it's attunement and not mastery, that there are other ways to engage work. If we're speaking about the sort of aesthetic, there's other ways to engage rather than thinking that one must pin the object down and completely understand it. And if we're speaking outside of the aesthetic, I think we might see something like Black mastery functioning in other areas. And then I wanted to say something about, I'm wondering how people see the sort of different bodies of Lawson's work. So the work that's distressed and has the holograms, but then I'm thinking of like the photographs in Haiti or in other places. I mean, they're quite sort of different bodies of work that seem to be doing different things. And I'm wondering how we think about those stagings in other sort of geographical locations. And if they're doing the same kind of work of kind of terrible beauty, or
I mean, what I would add to that is the correction facility series. That series I think is also really fascinating. That over time about the couple and the family configuration in all of those prison photographs, but also in response to what you were saying, asking about in terms of outside of North America. And there I think, maybe I'm confusing the term, I was thinking about something that might be Black masterfulness, right, as opposed to mastery. That I can actually get my head around about what might we think of as masterful, and how that might be a really fascinating thing. And if that's Jonathan, if that's your question, I think there's a lot of space that creates a lot of space. Tavia, go ahead, you're unmuted.
Oh, no, that is just out of excitement at that formulation, because in the way I feel like Jonathan has covered and opened up a whole can of worms at the end of this conversation. But the idea of mastery and Black mastery immediately for me evokes the kind of contradiction, right, between the dialectic of mastery and slavery, in which the master is actually not masterful at all. It's just simply ordering someone else to do a thing. It's actually the position who's the enslaved person who's actually has the masterfulness, right? Who's actually capable of reproducing like the conditions that the master then kind of siphons from, right? So whereas in a kind of in the sort of formalist language, or just in the aesthetic language, that I think, you know, to Christina's point, would invite a diasporic conversation about the varieties of masterfulness through which, and it doesn't necessarily even, I think masterfulness is still a category or a value to which many artists are have ambivalent relationships to. Even if they're seeking a version of it, they may also be trying to kind of reconstruct what masterfulness looks like in their medium, right? Perhaps Deana Lawson is, I mean, I saw they're not exactly decals, but the interruption of the sort of masterfulness of the large scale Guggenheim photograph with something that just, you know, almost snapshots like taped to a wall, you know, like disruptions of the expectations of masterfulness that then kind of open out to a new form of Black masterfulness, right? You know, that is a refusal of mastery. So I like that distinction you're proposing. And I think it just speaks to the, you know, the other, yeah, this is a big can of worms, but the other artist I think about a lot right now is Rashad Newsom, whose work I've been very kind of close to in the past couple months, and someone who's deeply invested in something that I would think of as, you know, masterful, while explicitly and continuously devoted to kind of decolonizing the relationship between, you know, art and artist and audience, right? Really trying to explicitly trying to use, and, you know, bell hooks and Paulo Freire to, you know, create conditions in which Black people can enter institutions in which we've felt historically excluded by their associations with mastery, and actually recognize them as our own, you know, that they belong to us, right? And a certain kind of masterfulness is, you know, or sly masterfulness enables that.
Lovely.
Okay, I think we may have reached, I won't say a natural stopping point, but a stopping point. I think, Mabel, did you want to make any announcements on behalf of IRAS?
I do. Do you want me to? I'll just go ahead and just say, one, thank you all. I think it's really been an extraordinary conversation. I agree with Michael, so much to discuss about the book, that I think this is definitely a to be continued. But thank you all for, you know, agreeing to share in conversation and in dialogue with Tina and this really wonderful book. I also just want to give a special thanks to our dedicated colleagues Sean Mendoza and Sharon Harris for all they did behind the work. I also, both are ASL interpreters today as well. And I just want to send a reminder of upcoming events for IRAS and Triple ADS. On Tuesday, March 24th, we will return with our conversation series with a discussion on the recent publication, The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship by Deb Willis, who actually writes a blurb for Tina Campt on the book. And she will be in conversation with Eric Foner. So thank you all for coming. I'll turn it over to Jack.
Okay, thank you, Mabel. Just two announcements from me. We have Veronica Gago joining us in person March 22nd, and then April 25th, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender also welcomes Bonnie Hernig. I want to thank also Michael, Tavia, Christine, Tina for this amazing event. The subtitle to Tina's book is Artists Changing How We See, and I think we probably all agree that Tina's book is also changing how we see. we are honored, we are grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.